With the number of electric vehicles increasing, America needs thousands of high-speed EV chargers scattered across the country so that it's as easy to charge an electric vehicle as it is to fill a car with gas. Our existing network of gas stations, convenience stores, and other retail locations are ideally situated to meet this need, conveniently located with the amenities that drivers expect. So why don't you see high-speed EV chargers at gas stations? Unfortunately, the EV charging marketplace is largely dominated by the power companies, and they have significant built-in economic advantages that make it virtually impossible for private retailers to get into the EV charging business. That's why you almost never see EV chargers at gas stations today. So the question is, what are these advantages that the power companies have, and how do we level the playing field to enable more businesses to get into the EV charging industry? Well, first of all, some states still treat EV charging retailers as full-scale power companies, creating massive amounts of regulations for these private businesses. Simply put, in these states, some retailers aren't even allowed to resell electricity. Thankfully, this hurdle is being eliminated as more and more states acknowledge that antiquated policies prohibiting the resale of electricity are simply nonsensical. Secondly, power companies are getting you and me to pay for their upstart EV charging operations. The same entity that produces and sells electricity is now offering EV charging to drivers, and they are paying for it by hiking the monthly power bill that you and I pay at home. This practice is known as rate basing, and it eliminates any chance for competition. When the power company can get you and me to pay for the cost of buying, installing, and operating high-speed EV chargers, private companies just can't compete with that. What makes rate basing even more unfair is that people who don't even own an EV are paying for people who can afford expensive electric vehicles to charge up on the cheap. And third, the current electricity rate structure for EV charging makes no economic sense. Home power bills are largely driven by how much electricity we use in a month. However, the power bills for businesses, like gas stations, is largely driven by the maximum amount of electricity that the business uses at any 15-minute period during the month. This fee is known as a demand charge, and a high-speed EV charging causes demand charges to go through the roof. Plugging an EV into a high-speed charger is the electricity equivalent of turning on a fire hose. Even if a retailer only gets one customer per month, their demand charge will spike. Until retailers have enough EV charging customers to share this cost, selling EV charging is a money-losing venture. And demand charges are fees that power companies charge other businesses, but they don't charge themselves at their own stations. So that's another cost advantage for power companies. Fortunately, these issues can be resolved for more retailers to get into EV charging. We're not saying that power companies can't be in the EV charging business. They should just have to operate under the same rates, terms, and conditions that everyone else has to abide by. First of all, private retailers selling EV charging should not be classified as a power company. Secondly, power companies should be prohibited from rate basing to pay for the cost of owning and operating EV charging stations. Thirdly, legislators and regulators must establish a rate structure that makes sense for EV charging. There is an array of industry-specific electricity rates already in place, and EV charging should be no different. These three changes will level the playing field and invite the free market, private investment, and competition into EV charging. This is what we need in order to have the EV charging network that America needs and EV drivers want. Thank you.